Hi, my name is Emiel Ramakers, and this is a session on the Oracle Database Service for Azure, or ODSA. This is the fourth in a four-part series in which we have a look at some of the advanced topics, and in this session we'll talk about disaster recovery and high availability for ODSA. So what I'll go through is some of the architecture drawings, etc., of what are the various options that you can do, and I'll show you some of the additional collateral that we have around that. As I said, there are some other sessions in this series. We have a session that is a bit of an introduction, and then we have a session that has much more of a deep dive into what are the components that actually make up this service. And in session 3 we had a look at the hub and spoke networking and how to plug ODSA into that. But let's go and have a look at what are the high availability and disaster recovery options for ODSA. We will talk a little bit about DR and HA within ODSA. And there are some important things to realize here. And the first one is, the most important one really, is that there is no data guard setup out of the box through the ODSA console. So unlike OCI, where through the OCI console you can set up a data guard instance and have everything basically set up automatically, you cannot do that through the ODSA console. Even though ODSA creates a database service that is a normal OCI database service, there are some limitations to the ODSA console where you cannot do exactly the same things that you can do through the OCI console. So, of course, because it is still an OCI database service, you can use the OCI console to do things, to do anything that you want to, really, because it is just a normal OCI database service. The drawback of that is that when you do that, for example, when you go and use the OCI console to create a data guard standby instance, it creates a non-ODSA database. ODSA doesn't know anything about that database that you just created. So that database will never be known to ODSA, and you've got out of the ODSA controlled environment with that second instance. So that's something to think about. We will have a look at some of the diagrams after this to go deeper into what the pros and cons of a situation like that are. So the normal advised way of doing this would be to create two initially standalone ODSA databases and then manually set up data guard between them. So get rid of the data files of one of them and basically replace them with those of the first of the primary and set up manual data guard between them. That means that at this moment in time, there is no solution for autonomous where that is concerned, because you cannot do that for autonomous. There is a nice blog on this, which I'll just quickly link to. So this blog is here. The blog explains a little bit about the regions that we are and which regions you can use, and then it goes in not too much detail into what you've got to do to set this up, and I will talk you through that a little bit how to do that. The steps here are the 5 steps, but don't be think about this a little bit before you do this, because it sounds like it's just the 5 steps, but they're actually pretty complicated, especially if you haven't done manual standby database setup maybe in a while. So when we go back here, and let's just go and have a look at some of these patterns a little bit closer. So let's start to have a look at what that looks like. So we'll start with just one region definition. So in this case we have a nice hub and spoke network on the Azure side, but it doesn't really matter what we have on the Azure side in this example. We connect through ODSA to either a XR or a base database in a VCN, or an autonomous database which exists in the normal way that autonomous databases do in OCI. If we want to make this into a DR to another region, then as per the block that I mentioned, And the other things that I mentioned earlier, when we want to do that with ODSA, we are limited. So because ODSA cannot create a standby database for us, it means that we can only do that manually. We cannot use the OCI tooling. We'll have a look at that on the next slide, because if we use the OCI tooling, then we create a non-ODSA database, and therefore we then lose the ODSA control of it in the second region. So we'll have a deeper dive into that on the next slide. But if we want to have ODSA on both sides, the solution is to create two separate ODSA databases in each region, and then manually set up data card between them. So copy all of the data files from the primary over to the secondary, and then completely manually set up data card between those. Now, of course, you've got to be quite careful with this, because we're selling a cloud service, and this is the opposite of easy cloud service, click or call an API and any of that stuff. This is non-trivial to set this up. It is certainly possible, and we've made this work. And you can set this up if it's absolutely required. But as I said, it is non-trivial, and you really need to understand quite a bit about your databases and how to set up data guard and how to do that manually. An alternative, which really isn't an alternative, but I want to give the detail here just to put it into context, is to use the OCI tooling to create these standby databases. So in this case, we can do that for Autonomous as well, because with Autonomous we can create a standby database and Autonomous data card. And we can also use the OCI tooling to do that for EXA or even for base, automatically into another region. Now, the problem with this is that in that second region, we have now created an OCI database that ODSA does not know anything about. And ODSA cannot adopt existing databases. So these databases will never be part of ODSA, and therefore, if you really want to do this, you have to now find a other way to connect your OCI region with your Azure region in region 2. Now, if this is an interconnect region, you can still use the interconnect. If it's not an interconnect region, then you might use a partner to do the connectivity. The problem with this setup, and the reason to be very careful when talking about this, is the selling point of ODSA is that it abstracts away some of the OCI stuff, and that you are basically living just in your Azure world. What you're doing with a setup like this is, in region 2, you basically have to manage the whole OCI side yourself. There is no ODSA to manage anything there, and you have to set up the connection, etc., etc. So if you propose this, you're basically proposing the customer to pick up OCI without ODSA in at least one region. So you could ask yourself, what is actually the point now of having ODSA in the first region in the first place? Because you have to do stuff in the second region anyway. So whilst this is technically feasible and probably easier to set up than the first example, it is not a good use case for ODSA, because it just opens up questions about why would I use ODSA in the first place. So if ODSA is important, if ODSA is the way into a customer because they want that assurance of being in an Azure-like environment, then this is certainly not a good way to go. If a customer doesn't want that, if they're quite open to just use OCI services and they're quite happy to connect over an interconnect, then you've probably got to think that that might be a good idea in both regions anyway. So in either case, ODSA is probably not in the right place in a scenario like this. There is a third thing to think about, and there are a number of ways to solve this, and this is just one, but that is a second region, a standby region that the customer has already chosen, where there is no OCI in the same area. So this is a typical example in EMEA is, for example, an Azure customer that is using Amsterdam and Dublin as their failover pair. And of course, we have an OCI region in Amsterdam that we can connect to Azure, but we have nothing locally in Dublin. So there are a number of ways to try to solve that. One of them would be to basically say, well, let's not have an OCI standby. Let's just have a local standby. There are other things, for example, just to route to the closest OCI region that you can possibly can. In the case of Dublin, that would probably be London, and have a not so low latency connection between Azure and OCI there. But if for DR purposes that is good enough, then that's an option that you could take. There were quite a lot of things to think about in this scenario, so it's not something that we can easily go and discuss just what you should do. It really depends on the customer, it depends on what the customer wants, and it depends on the latency that the application can accept, etc. So as we said, you can use the OCI console, but it creates an ODSA database, so you don't want to do that. So the solution, if you want to use ODSA with standby databases, is to create those two ODSA databases and set up manual data cards between them. That also means that there is no current solution for autonomous. So whenever you are in a situation like this, we would urge you to involve the multi-cloud specialist team, of which I am part, or the product management team, or rather through the specialist team, we would involve the product management team, and we can really find the best solution for a customer that is in this situation, because these are non-trivial situations that we really need to think about carefully. So I thank you very much, and I hope to speak to you soon on another session. Thank you.